Welcome back to another episode of Creedle. I am joined today by my friend Andrew Petiprin, who's been on the show before. And we are talking about a number of things, but the reason why I contacted Andrew and asked him to come on this time was because I was watching this Netflix movie called Don't Look Up, which you may have seen. It is, I think at least last week, it was like the number one Netflix movie for that week. And I think it set records, Andrew, for the number of times or number of hours, number of minutes viewed across Netflix. So it seems like half of Netflix's subscribers have now seen this film, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, as Kate Blanchett in it as well. Tyler Perry. I mean, it's really kind of an all-star. Oh, not to mention Meryl Streep, of course, and Jonah Hill. Like, it's really an all-star cast, and there's a lot to sort of unpack in this movie. Andrew wrote an article about the movie on onwardonfire.org. Unbeknownst to me, when I asked him to come on, he said, "Hey, I've already written about it. Let's do it." So I will link to that article in the show notes. But Andrew, welcome back to Creedle. Lovely to have you.
Great to be back, Zach.
Yeah, I always enjoy your insights and love hanging out with a fellow film buff. I should mention to listeners who did not listen to your previous appearance on this podcast that you are the fellow of popular culture at the Word on Fire Institute. You're an author, you are a former Anglican priest, and now you are with your family in full communion with the Catholic Church, having entered in, I think, 2019.
Yes.
And you're graduate of Yale University, where you earned your MDiv, and Oxford University, where you earned an MPhil.
Right.
And I know we talked about Oxford before, but I don't remember, what did you study at Oxford, Andrew?
I studied European literature, actually,
Okay.
Zach. I wanted to be a medievalist, early modern literary scholar and
Yeah.
linguist. So, yeah, I went to England and spent most of my time reading French poetry, believe it or not.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
uh that's pretty distinctive.
kind of
Um,
weird.
I mean, Oxford, though, you're in the footsteps of Lewis, and even more so, studying medieval literature in the footsteps of
Yeah.
Lewis. But people don't realize that was Lewis's academic specialty. He wasn't a theologian properly considered. He didn't teach on the theology faculty. He was a medieval literature guy, right?
Yeah, he was. And in fact, it could be that I decided to study that discipline there because I revered Lewis so much.
Hmm.
And I had the incredible opportunity to be at Lewis's college, at Magdalen College. That was my
Oh
college
wow.
at
Okay.
Oxford.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I forget which one you were at. Christchurch, was it?
Christchurch, yeah. Yep,
Yeah.
good memory. You remember more about my Oxford time than I did about yours, so apologies.
Well, no, I don't know about that, but yeah, it's fun that we were both there.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish we would have overlapped. That would have been fun. We could grab a pint at the Eagle and Child.
I've got a few years on you, I'm afraid, Zach.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this Don't Look Up film, Andrew. And then I would also love to pick your brain on this recent op-ed by Ross Douthat in the pages of the New York Times, in which he makes the very provocative claim that we need more sex and romance at the movies. You might think, hey, this guy's a Catholic, obviously Christian writer. Why is he saying we need more sex and romance? He's not exactly making the claim that sounds like at first pass, but we can talk about that as well. But let's unpack Don't Look Up. Now, you've written the sort of examination of this at the Word on Fire blog. I will link to that in the show notes. But tell our listeners who have not seen the movie, what is Don't Look Up?
Well, as you said, almost everybody has seen this movie, it seems like, from the
Yeah.
statistics. I mean, I don't really know anybody in my office or my family who hasn't seen it. It's just everybody's checking it out. And I think for good reason. It's a very funny movie. It's a very entertaining movie. I enjoyed the movie. I know that there are some critics of the film who thought it was a little bit too ham-fisted or a little bit too preachy or something like that. But part of what I get out in my article is I think it isn't quite. I think that it actually conveys something that transcends just kind of facile politics. And the idea of the movie is written by Adam McKay, or it's directed by Adam McKay, who directed a bunch of like kind of raunchy, funny movies in the early 2000s and beyond. And he's made a lot of movies that I enjoy. Viewers beware, if you click on some of those or check out some of those, it might be a little bit too much for some people's sensibility. I totally get it. But in this one, he's sort of playing with uh, some of these like tensions in our culture now between like, scientism, science, like belief in science, and then sort of people who either like from an informed perspective or just a kind of willful belligerence or something decide that they're just not going to believe the data. They're not going to believe in science. And so you get this sort of divide between people who are kind of those who know, the elites, and then those who are just, just sort of sheep or
Yeah.
whatever. And it's a very funny premise. You have Meryl Streep playing the president of the United States, who is this sort of like, kind of caricature of like a political opportunist, like basically sort of a right wing kind of
Populist, yeah.
populist sort of person, but also not particularly ideological. I mean,
Right.
she's all that matters to her is poll numbers and appearance and all of that sort of thing.
Right.
And
And the
she
campaign trucker hats reappear, but this time they don't say "Make America Great Again." They say "Don't look up."
They say, "Don't look up."
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of leads to the big issue in the movie, which is the coming of this comet, which is supposed to destroy the entire planet. And some people read it as like an allegory for the pandemic, maybe,
Right.
or kind of more accurately, probably something like an allegory for climate change or something. I think that was what McKay had in mind when
Yep.
he was originally writing the script. Um, but it works for a whole number of things that we're thinking about in our culture today. Just, that you have this sort of supposed elite kind of science oriented class, who sort of are, presenting the data with all of their passion, with all of their energy, and just, screaming into the wind to get people to hear them out. And still, only around half the country that corresponds maybe to one of the two political parties is going to hear them, and the other are going to believe that they're being duped, or that they're being lied to, or that the picture is more complicated than that. um, so it really touches on issues that we can all relate to.
Yeah.
But yeah, the premise is that there are these scientists. There's Jennifer Lawrence, who plays this Kate Dibiasky character, who's a graduate student, and she's on duty one night looking through the telescope and discovers this comet that's going to destroy the Earth. So she calls in her advisor, who's played by Leonardo DiCaprio, to check her numbers and verify
Yeah.
everything, and they decide it's real and it's going to hit the Earth. And so one thing leads to another, and before they know it, they're in the White House trying to pitch their case to the president that the human race is in imminent danger. And it just goes from there into all kinds of hilarious and disturbing and interesting directions.
Yeah, I found it to be I don't know, I found the sort of arc of my experience as I was watching the show was first, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then I dipped down into sort of this is actually it feels like a rather sort of predictable political caricature that's quite obviously a commentary on climate change and how half the country isn't taking climate change and its threat seriously. And then I think by the end of the movie, I sort of come back up and said, oh, actually, I think there's maybe something more interesting that's being said here. I also think there's a good possibility that some of the most interesting things that are being said are things that Adam McKay isn't even intending to say.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's sort of like a second or even a third level of analysis that we can do in the film and say what does this reveal to us about ourselves, about the nature of being human, about the nature of the particular political moment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's the real thing for us to highlight is, whether Adam McKay really realized it or not, we don't really know exactly. But for me, the crux of the whole message of the movie is this character Yule, played by Timothy
Yeah.
Chalamet. And I think he just on the surface represents this sort of burnout, flyover, middle America sort of loser who has these, who has a Christian background, but doesn't really live a kind of Christian morality per se. He's sort of rejected his parents'
Yeah.
stuffy attitudes towards things, and he likes to do drugs and steal and have sex and things like that. But at the end of the day, he still has this sort of like Christian eschatology built into his psyche. Like he still basically and actually has a kind of a view of God's providence. He basically lives in the world as if God's in control of it, and God's going to do what God wants to do. And you can sort of enjoy life or not, but it really isn't worth it to kind of get bent out of shape about how to save the world per se. Not that he's particularly opposed to, like, trying to do good things to help people or anything like that, but he's just sort of like, if the comet's going to destroy the Earth, it's going to destroy the Earth. And funnily enough, at the end of the movie, a small spoiler, but the comet comes. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
But when it does, he's the only one who's equipped for the moment, in a sense. Like, he's the only one who knows how to pray. And when he does, he just asks God for the simple gift of grace, just to encourage people to face the fear. And he sort of inspires this whole group of people sitting around the table to just be grateful, even
Yeah.
though they're facing their death.
Yeah, that was certainly an unexpected part of the film. I was watching it with Sally, and we got to. I mean, for again, we already spoiled a little bit, so the comet does indeed impact Earth. And you don't actually know if that's going to happen up until the final sort of 15 minutes of the movie, and then you realize, oh, it's happening, right? This is the end. Um, and that's it's apparent that that's going to happen. So everyone's sort of preparing in their own unique ways. And then and the Leonardo DiCaprio's character, the scientist, returns to his family. He had sort of estranged himself by having an affair prior to that. He returns to his family though, and brings his doctoral student, played by Jennifer Lawrence, and she brings Yule, who's the boyfriend. And so it's DiCaprio's family and Jennifer Lawrence and her boyfriend all around the table. And then yeah, it's that prayer from Yule that just totally comes out of nowhere. You are not expecting that at all. He
Yeah.
has been up to that point in the film one of the, maybe not up to that point, but it certainly when he's introduced and at other points he's sort of a less profound figure. Like you said, he just seems like a simple Midwest kind of skater guy. He's got the long hair of it. He wears the beanie and is certainly a friendly chap, but not one that you would look to save everybody. And then he says grace in this absolutely beautiful and unexpected way at the end of the movie, and then basically cut to credits. Almost,
Yeah.
there's a little bit more to it than that, but
Well, and the funny thing that happens before it, well, not funny, I mean, just kind of intriguing thing that happens before that is Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Professor Mindy, I think his name is.
yep,
His just sort of, it just sort of wells up within him all of a sudden that he's a man of science. He's not a man of prayer. He's not a religious person. And he says, we don't pray in this house. We're not a religious household or whatever. But he says something like, it would be appropriate, wouldn't it, to say amen right now?
yeah,
It's like it sort of reveals, and again, this is one of those things that you don't quite know whether Adam McKay meant this with the depth that people like us anyway kind of perceive it, but that we just know deep within us. We know that the only response is a moment of prayer.
yeah,
That when we're contemplating our mortality, when we're really facing the end, whether that's our natural deaths or some kind of catastrophic event that's happening in the life of the world, or whatever it may be, some kind of crisis or trauma that we're having in our lives, we just can't help it. It's
yeah.
like we're hardwired for it. And so, this man of science with no religion just decides it's a moment of prayer. And thank God this burnout Yule is there who can kind of provide the gift to the rest of the people.
Yeah, and to add maybe one additional piece of analysis to that, amen obviously means let it be done.
Yeah.
It's a statement of completion or a statement of affirmation. And so on one level, it's funny, right? Oh, this scientist thinks you just pray by saying amen when you're holding hands at the dinner table. That's not what a prayer is. But what he's saying, like this is literally the end of the world, and he's saying, I guess we should say amen. It is done. And Yule says basically, not so fast. This is how you do it, and he actually
Yeah.
basically commends him and his companions at the dinner table uh, to the hands of God, which is a pretty cool and very Christian way to end the film.
Yeah, and they don't hedge on that at all. I mean, the prayer that
Yeah.
he offers is a it's exactly the kind of prayer that I remember hearing in evangelical circles in my teen years. I mean, it's not some, vague prayer to some
Yeah.
spirit in the sky or something like that. I
Right.
mean, it is to the God and Father of us all.
Yep.
It is, I mean, to us Christians, it is to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the
Right.
world, right?
Right.
So to me, that was just the most fascinating thing. And I sort of characterize that whole part where she meets Yule all the way to the end of the movie as this sort of really spiritual third act that
Hmm.
I almost didn't see coming. Because before that, you've got sort of all this political stuff with the president and her kind of idiot son, played by Jonah
Jonah Hill.
Hill, who's like almost just too ridiculous to believe in
Yeah.
his disdain for people who don't see things the way he does and all of
Yeah.
that kind of thing, and just how much of a fool he is. Um, so there's all of that, and then there's the whole media thing.
Yeah.
There's Tyler Perry and Kate Blanchett who play these like talk show hosts, and to me their roles were so interesting because they just represent how in our culture we have all of this media, but it doesn't know what to do with
Hmm.
something really serious. I mean, everything seems serious, like, oh my goodness, what's today's crisis and how are
Right.
we reacting or something like
Right.
that. But it's so obviously packaged for our reaction, for a kind of event that sort of looks good on camera or that
Hmm.
kind of plays well, you know, being shared over social media or something like that. But when someone comes on your TV show and says, "I have calculations proving a comet's about to hit our country or about to hit our world and destroy us all," they just don't know what to do. So what ends up happening is, Professor Mindy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, ends up getting put into this box of this sort of sexy scientist, and his graduate student Kate ends up taking on the persona of this sort of alarmist hysterical person, who becomes kind of a meme for
Yeah.
people freaking out unnecessarily. And how often do we see that in our world today, that like we want to put people, whether they're spokesmen for this or that, or they represent one view or another, into these different categories, and then we sort of ally ourselves, don't we, with one or the other. We sort of, it's not really the message that matters, but the messenger. And this plays out in so many different ways in the movie. Coming back to your point about the hat that says "Don't look up," that there
Hmm.
developed then these two camps: the "Don't look up" camp and the "Look up" camp. And then there are these like funny moments where there are these sort of, can't we all just sort of get along and bring it together, like let's look up and
Right.
down, and
Yeah.
similar to the same kind of like sort of silly, kind of empty reconciliatory rhetoric that we hear
Yep.
from time to time in our own media now.
Yeah, real quick, my favorite line from Jonah Hill's character was when he was talking to Kate Dibiasky and who played by Jennifer Lawrence and DiCaprio's Professor Mindy, and he finds out that Kate is a doctoral student at. It is Kate, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
I believe it's Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he finds out that Kate is a doctoral student at Michigan State, and he looks at
Right.
everyone. He's like, "Come on, really? Michigan State?"
Uh-huh.
He's just scoffing because
Yeah.
it's not an Ivy League institution
Right,
or
and they make
MIT.
much ado over, they need to talk to some sort of Harvard and Princeton and Yale
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
to kind of verify what they're hearing. Which again, I mean, I think that that's one of the major subtexts of the film that resonates with viewers, is this elitism
Yeah.
business. We live in this world of credentialism, and
Hmm.
um, it really, truth is this very elusive thing compared to some of these other more surface issues of
Yeah.
credentials, or what the messenger looks like. All these sorts of things.
Yeah. Could not agree with you more. I think the media point's really interesting as well, because in the movie they are constitutionally incapable of dealing with an actual crisis. And it's not totally clear why. I think part of it's because the media personalities themselves, Blanchett and Perry in this case, don't really have a sort of heuristic for wrestling with that. And part of it is because of their revenue model, just like is the case with today's 24-hour news cycle. The revenue model does not allow for news that people are not ready to hear. It definitely incentivizes um, uh, the news that people either want to hear or the news that scares them. But this is a different thing entirely, because this isn't simply, we're going to scare you to watch more news. This is something that is so cataclysmic, literally, that they can't fit it into their model. They don't have a framework for doing that, for broadcasting news about the literal end of the world that is upon us, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So they end up just really burying their heads in the sand. And it's a very interesting thought experiment to ask what would happen if we were facing the end of the world and there was nothing we could do about it. What would the news be telling us about?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting in the film to see that it plays out exactly as you say in their first appearance when they come on the show. I
Yeah.
mean, they sort of don't know what to say to these astrophysicists. I mean, they're sitting there telling them that the end of the world is coming, and all they can think to say is, "What, do you think there are aliens on, life on other planets or something
Right.
like that?" Right?
Yeah.
But then the narrative shifts in the culture, and people really do start to freak out about this sort of impending doom. And I don't know about you, but I mean, I felt like it was sort of a deja vu experience, watching the way the media has sort of, flown in one direction after another with the pandemic stuff. I mean, it's sort of like once it sort of becomes like they do ultimately sort of know how to tell the story, but it has to sort of become we're talking about what everybody's talking about thing,
Yep.
and then, as you say, it becomes this sort of commodity that people want to consume, which is a really different thing than telling the news. And from a kind of evangelist perspective, you might think of it in terms of like telling the good news, right? I
Yeah.
mean, um, we try to package it in ways, I suppose, that people want to consume, but ultimately it's always going to be a bit of a bitter pill to swallow. I mean, it doesn't fit in any of the categories that people are used to seeing it in. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but it's very interesting in the film to see the way in which the story sort of ebbs and flows, and the way that it
Mhm.
develops and becomes this thing for a while, where, okay, fine, let's accept that the world is going to end. How do we tell that story in this kind of way
Yeah.
that fits our profit model, as you say?
Yeah, I like your point about how we receive it now in the context of what we've experienced recently. Adam McKay, like you said, has been upfront about saying this is a movie about climate change. That's he wrote it in a pre-COVID world, and his target was climate change. And the subtext there, it's not even really a subtext. It is a bit on the nose, I think. Is we're all ignoring the absolute catastrophe that is climate change. It's barreling toward us. There's very little that we can do to stop it. If we have a chance to stop it, it's only through collective action and recognition of the problem. Short of that, we're all going to face total annihilation, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think that comparison fails on a number of levels. And actually, I'll recommend Eric Levitz's article in the New York Magazine that describes why exactly that comparison is not apt. I would posit that this is actually a better sort of pandemic movie than a climate change movie, because of the ways that it forces us to examine what does our life look like in the face of the end, right? Mortality comes to us all. Maybe it won't come from a spike protein in a virus. Maybe it won't come from a comet, but it will come for each of us. Death will come knocking. Memento mori, in the Catholic tradition, you will die someday. So it forces us to answer that question. And then I think also this whole expert class line of argumentation is really, really interesting. Um, the movie wants to posit that there is the expert class that is correct, and then there is basically everyone else who ignores them, right? from the media to politicians in the halls of power to the people on the streets who are just so sort of immersed in their TikToks that they don't really care what the experts are saying. There's something to that for sure, but that message actually I think has less sort of purchase right now in early 2022 than it would have 2 years ago in early 2020, because the expert class has sort of, I think, been exposed largely in COVID, as not knowing what they're talking about. And also, by the way, they're not monolithic, right? So there are experts that there is no singular expert classes, I guess, is sort of one of my main points. There are experts who have varying views on how effective masks are. For example, should we mask children in schools? How far apart should the boosters be from the vaccine? Which vaccine offers the most protection? What's the best protective measure for the octogenarians and above in the face of COVID? What do we do with the economy, et cetera? And so there is no singular expert class, but also there are a lot of experts whose opinions have been largely sort of followed and trumpeted in media, and those opinions have ended up being wrong. And so I think I think now we look at this and say, okay, the experts say that. Who cares, right? That's
Right.
I sort of watch the movie now and honestly am more sympathetic to the Don't Look Up crowd than I think I would have been in 2020, because the experts fail us, and that's a very real thing that I think the expert class needs to wrestle with. And I think hopefully maybe it probably won't happen, but maybe this film offers some opportunity for the expert class, to the extent that it is monolithic, to say, okay, maybe we miss the mark sometimes. How can we make our message more relevant, and most importantly, how can we make sure that we are credible to people? Because without the credibility, there's nothing.
Yeah, I think that all of that is right on that you've just said. I mean, I think that there's like a deep, um, if not distrust, there's a reticence now about expertise, that didn't. I mean, that's pretty widespread, I would say, in the culture. That wasn't the case a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
probably. And I think the movie actually handles that idea relatively well. And I mean that, the main experts in the movie, and particularly the Leonardo DiCaprio character,
Hmm.
he ultimately doesn't prove himself. I mean, he comes back around at the end and
Yeah.
sort of has this sort of, this redemption moment
Right.
of sorts. But he does not stay the course as a man of principle. I mean, he gets sucked into this world of, crafting a message that people want to
Yep.
hear, and he ends up really not having standing with kind of the full stature, the full integrity of this sort of, un, um, a irreproachable man of science, right?
Right. Right.
Um, so I think that's really important. The other thing is there's this other figure in the movie, played by Mark Rylance. I now forget the name of his character, but he's this billionaire character,
Oh yeah,
who,
yeah. I'll
right,
look it up. Yeah.
who also,
He's kind of like a mashup of like Bill Gates and Elon Musk.
yeah, that's right. And I mean, he's this billionaire figure who's, a bit of, very much a caricature of these kinds of eccentric billionaire
Peter
types.
Isherwell. Sorry, that's the name of the character.
Isherwell,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, Peter Isherwell, and he also kind of represents the expert class. I mean,
Totally.
and yet he clashes with the experts because he wants to kind of, he thinks they think too small.
Hmm.
That the experts say, okay, look, we have this data, we've got this comet, we have to eradicate it. That's all we can do. And he says, no, but the real expert, the real genius in the modern world would say, how can we not only take this catastrophe and get rid of it, but how can we turn this catastrophe into a blessing? And you see then the tension sort of among the elite class about, like, what do we do then? Do we like take this extra risk and try and do something different other than
Right.
just like send a rocket up into the sky and blow this comet up so it won't hit the earth? And um, and they also, the McKay isn't facile about which one ultimately would have been the best option. There kind of is this sense at the end that, oh, well, if they had just followed the original course and constructed some plan and tried to destroy the comet or something, followed the original expert advice, then everything would have been
Hmm.
okay. But we don't know for sure because we
Right.
didn't actually see the experiment work, and we didn't, so
Yep.
we're left kind of thinking we don't really know for sure who was right in the end, among the experts. The other thing that I think McKay, refreshingly didn't do was he didn't give us this just kind of, bald face, sort of, apology for voting in one particular direction or the other,
Hmm.
right? Like, you don't have this message at the end of the movie, which is essentially like, "Hey, America, if everybody just voted the right way, everything would be fine." Because I just don't, it does happen that it seems like the president in this movie is a bit of a right wing demagogue, but it's not clear at the end of the movie that, somebody representing some other ideology would have done anything any better.
Yeah.
So, so I was kind of appreciative of all of that. That it was more nuanced than just kind of the easy partisan answers.
Yeah, I totally appreciate all that, and I'm glad you brought up the Peter Isherwell character because there is this examination, maybe a bit on the nose, but probably appropriate, of sort of big tech in that regard because Bash Cellular is his company, and Bash Cellular is kind of like, I don't know, it's a probably a mashup of I don't know, Google, SpaceX, and Facebook, all together. They sort of run every bit of our ecosystem and the
Yeah.
metaverse and have rockets and all this stuff. Um, and it is basically like it's a stand-in for big tech, I think, and it's not good at all. You have Peter Isherwell who sort of speaks in the language of tech titans, right? We have to do good for humanity.
Yeah.
We have to enhance the general welfare, promote well-being throughout the world, etc. And actually, what he wants to do is advance well-being for himself and his cronies, at the
Yeah.
expense of everyone else. And so there's the emperor has no clothes, for big tech in the movie, which I think is also a good insight.
Yeah, and I think one of the best lines in the entire movie is when somebody is talking about this Isherwell character, and whoever it is says, "Oh yeah, that's the guy who bought the Gutenberg Bible and then lost it," which sort of reveals like
Yeah,
how big tech talks in this language, this sort of humane language, but underneath, it's not the real sort of humane understanding of existence kind of isn't there.
yeah,
It's like, having a Gutenberg Bible is just another acquisition. It's
yeah,
just another asset, right?
yeah.
Ultimately.
Well, I mean,
So to me, that was
even
really
that,
good.
yeah, I totally agree. Even that is a really rich spiritual metaphor because you going
Yeah.
back to our point about Yule and Yule ends up being sort of the guiding light for humanity around that dinner table at the end of the movie. The guy who thinks that he is the guiding light of humanity, this Peter Israel character, is the one who literally lost the plot. The plot being the Bible, right? The
Right.
Bible, God's divine word of God that shows us who we are, where we come from, where we're going. He literally lost it. So
Yeah.
again, very on the nose, but he lost the plot. He doesn't know how to sort of understand his situation, and his hubris now knows no bounds because he has no concept of God. He is
Yeah,
his
and
own
in
God.
fact, I mean, kind of the sinister, sort of a darker read of his character is, I mean, he really has sort of assumed a divine role for
Yeah,
himself,
yeah. There is
and
there's an
I mean, he's
antichrist
invent
element there,
yeah, I mean, he's even invented this tech, right? Which
right?
which is again kind of on the nose. This idea that like all of the sort of consumer purchases that we make and all
Yep.
of the data that we put into the internet and all that sort of thing can in his world accurately predict your time and means of death even.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like it becomes this sort of this kind of alternate version of providence
Yeah.
actually that he
Yeah.
controls. And just one more thing about him is then the very very end of the movie, and maybe this part we won't give away, but I mean, there's this sort of extra ending part to the movie that further reveals this mentality, which is like, if we could only have enough wealth
Yeah.
and enough tech, we maybe don't ever have to die.
Yep.
Like we can really control our own destiny and expose the lie of these dumb Christians who think the world has to end.
Yeah. I was surprised in general to see that this was a work of Adam McKay. Because as you said, some of Adam McKay's movies are not ones that I would recommend to anyone without significant caveats. Adam McKay is also, I'm pretty sure, an executive producer of Succession, the hit HBO show that's really all about just naked power and sort of property quarrels among an elite family and its associates in New York City that run a media conglomerate. And then Adam McKay's done a lot of collaborations with Will Ferrell, as just a almost slapstick
Yeah.
comedian type. So really interesting to see his name on here. But having watched this, Andrew, I wonder what his personal convictions are about the existence of God and about where we are, because this movie is saying more profound things than I initially gave it credit for when I had watched the first 30 minutes of it. And I wonder what's going on in Adam McKay's mind. What is God doing in his soul right now? It's always interesting to think about that.
Let's pray for him.
For
That's
sure.
what I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gears a little bit. I wanted to get your take on this Ross Douthat column that I mentioned, where he's saying that we need sex and romance at the movies. And I'll try to do a segue here, and you can tell me this is a good segue, Andrew. But Yule, going back to Yule's character, and Kate, the PhD student who's the one who discovers the comet, they obviously are in a relationship, and it's a relationship that sort of just happens. It doesn't seem to be particularly passionate, but Yule really seems to like her. I think she enjoys his company, but it seems like the passion, if there is any, is more one sided. And Yule's the one who has the passion. There's this one point where they're driving in the car. Yule's in the back seat, Kate's in the passenger seat, and Professor Mindy DiCaprio is in the driver's seat. And Yule basically says to Kate, "Hey, I really like you. We should do something about it. Like maybe get engaged or something."
Yeah.
And she like laughs, and then she says, "Sure, it's the end of the world. Why not? Let's get engaged." Um, and so I think this is probably a good segue. I'll let you give me a rating for the segue here, but I think this is a good foray to this Douthat op-ed, which is saying, look, we've lost this sense of deep abiding love stories and passion in our romances. We see some romances on screen. They happen here and there, but it's been a long time since we've had like a really good romantic movie.
Hmm.
Um, or even, as he says, a sex movie. We just don't have those things anymore, and we need more of those. And he,
Yeah.
he has he has these various reasons. But what do you think of that for a segue? How'd I do?
I think that's a good segue. I mean, I think arguably Yule is a bit of a romantic. Like
Yeah,
Yule maybe is the only one in the movie who has this kind of romantic sensibility. And so yeah, he's sort of falling in love with this like quirky grad student girl who comes into his life, even though up to the point where she agrees to, get engaged with him as the world seems to be coming to an end. she is, she's only interested in him because there's nobody else around, and heck, why the heck not? Let's just get, let's have some physical contact because why not? That kind of thing. And she really does seem to represent sort of something more like the hookup culture, or just
Yeah.
kind of a passionless, um, the kind of culture that seems to really not have eros anymore.
Right.
The sort of this sense of a mysterious romantic uh, sensibility
Right.
anymore. And I think that this is something that Douthit is getting at, and something that I notice about recent movies as well. Douthit has this bigger thesis about decadence in
Hmm.
films in particular, and it's one that I think is right. I mean, I think that he identifies that a lot of cinema is characterized by reboots, sequels, resurrecting the same plots and themes and franchises and all these kinds of things. And to him, this represents kind of an exhausted culture, just a culture that sort of doesn't really know, isn't really passionate about anything, just kind of wants to see things to divert its attention from other things. And he has some points, and maybe isn't entirely right about all of it, but the love story stuff I think is pretty spot on.
Yeah.
Um, and you can notice this in various ways. I know that Douthit mentions this with regard to Disney movies, that a lot of recent Disney movies don't have. They're good. They're perfectly good. Movies like Coco, or Encanto, or some of the more recent animated ones. They're very, very good, but
Hmm.
they don't have that kind of fairy tale. They don't have the shape of a fairy tale anymore, which almost always includes a love story. Why does it always include a love story? Because um, on some level, and again, this isn't necessarily something that like the storytellers or filmmakers are always entirely like conscious of, but
Hmm.
for Christians, we can point to, this sort of eschatological view of the bridegroom Christ, and
Hmm.
the church, his bride, right? That we have sort of this longing within us, and this is why Christianity to some degree makes sense, because we have this desire for this like consummation, to
Yep.
like to be loved by the one who loved us into existence, right?
Yep.
Um, and a simple love story that has a kind of mystery about it, like a boy, I know it sounds so simple, but like a boy and girl fall in love with each other. Maybe the love is forbidden, maybe there are complications, right? We are just naturally very interested in seeing that story resolve itself well, right? The fairy tale, and they lived happily ever after. We want to see that. And so a lot of these stories that are being told nowadays are good stories, and they say other things. They have other good sort of messages of virtue, perhaps like maybe messages of sacrifice, or like how much family matters, like all kinds
Sure.
of different
Yeah.
things. But they're sort of lacking this almost like primeval sort of like romantic thing. Whether that's like superhero movies or Disney movies, or just whatever your run of the mill stuff. But what you sadly have in its place, instead of eros, instead of kind of the mystery of love, is you just have something more akin to pornography. You have basically just sort of just the sense of the physical.
Yep.
Um, and this is something that one of my favorite writers, Sir Roger Scruton, wrote about. That it's like, the difference between pornography and art, and the difference is mystery. If you look at the painting of the Birth of Venus at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, for example, nobody would stand in front of that painting of a naked woman and say, "Oh, that's obscene." You
Hmm.
just wouldn't, right? You
Hmm.
just wouldn't. You would look at it and you would see beauty and mystery in it, right? Whereas a work of pornography, you would instantly go, "Oh gosh,"
Yeah.
it would have a completely different reaction.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to say in response to what you just said. First of all, totally agree. Um, I think, and I agree with Douthit's thesis almost entirely. I mean, I think he does say that we sort of are lacking the sex movie. I don't know. I think what we're really missing is the romance movie. I think I agree
Yep.
more with what you're saying, that where there is passion, or where there is sort of a romantic entanglement, what we get is sort of just like a mere carnal substitution. There's no real eros there. There's no real passion. There's just sort of physical desire, and that's it. And so in movies where it happens now, when you have a romance, that's why the characters are just hopping in bed on the first date. or why they're content with one night stands. There's no like abiding sense of sacrificial love. There's no, I think we've lost this idea of sort of love at first sight, till death do us part, because it's all just about sort of the physical now. Um, and I worry about where that's coming from. It's certainly not coming from the movies. The movies are not. Movies can shape culture, but movies are also shaped by culture,
Yes.
and that problem is coming from something prior to, antecedent to the film industry. As I was reading Dowd's piece, I was also thinking about this article I read in the past couple months by Jonah Goldberg, who's a conservative writer at the Dispatch. I read Jonah from time to time, and he had this article. I pulled it up here. It was written in, okay, so November 19th, 2021. And the title of this is, I think, Returning Japanese. I really think so. This is one of his email dispatches called the G file. And he goes on to talk about basically how we are becoming miserable. He uses as a starting point a piece by Yuval Levin, who's he kind of dabbles in philosophy and sociology, but he's a DC think tank guy, who wrote a piece in the Dispatch talking about this same problem, and commenting on a report on fertility and family formation that was issued by AEI a few weeks prior. And Yuval writes that he was struck by the report because it embodies a significant change in how we think about the basic character of social breakdown in America and what we take to be the obstacles to human flourishing in our time. He says, not long ago, it would have been, this is still Levin writing, not long ago, it would have been taken for granted that social order in our free society is a function of our capacity to restrain and govern our most intense longings. Human beings are moved by passionate desires for things like pleasure, status, wealth, and power. And so basically, one of the hypotheses is that we have lost these passionate desires. And so when you lose passion, you lose the sort of impulse to move, and to do things and to build things and to produce. And then so later in this article, Goldberg links it to Japan. He says, this all brings me to Japan. About a decade ago, people started noticing that something was amiss in the land of the rising sun. People weren't having sex, at least not a lot of it. A 2013 survey by the Japan Family Planning Association found that 45% of women aged 16 to 24, quote, were not interested in or despised sexual contact. More than 1 in 4 felt the same way. Terms like hikikomori, which is shut-ins or hermits, and parasito shingurus, which is parasite singles, in other words, adults who are still living with their parents into their mid-30s, became popular buzzwords. Otakus, which is geeks, cared more about playing esports than playing the field at bars. Soshoku danshi, herbivore men, that's the translation, or grass eater men are passive, unassertive men who have lost any interest in marriage or manliness as traditionally understood. A lot has been written about this, and many of the factors Yuval identifies are often part of the diagnosis. But basically, that is a major problem, and it has led to this massive demographic shift in Japan, and major economic problems too, because you have less productive younger generations. You have the what was the term? The parasite singles, the adults who are still living with their parents, the parasito shingurus, um, and maybe that's maybe we're not too far away from that. And I
Yeah.
think the movies are maybe a reflection of our sort of lack of passion in these regards.
Yeah, I wonder, a hunch of mine is just that this has to do with the smartphone revolution and just kind of just how younger people, they're just coming of age, with their entire existence
Yes.
mediated through phones. So I mean, even like young men, I mean, this is something I even talk about with my son, that a young man would rather play a video game where he can create a world on a game like Minecraft, right, than actually create something with his hands.
Yep.
And I think that that is having an impact on kind of physical relationships as well. I think another thing that might be happening is this awareness, which is a very good thing that's come out of the Me Too movement, which is that that men in particular can't just have their way. I mean,
Hmm.
they can't just act on their impulses and their urges, right? Which is good. That's true. That's very true. But I wonder if it's created in young men and women almost a kind of fear of real intimacy. Again, that's just sort of a hunch that I have. But I was thinking about this when I agree. I think that I think films nowadays really are struggling with this, like being unable
Hmm.
to tell kind of a real love story.
Yeah.
And maybe it's rooted in a couple of these things that I was mentioning, but there are some filmmakers who still get it right, or mostly right. And I was thinking about, I think there are certain European filmmakers in particular who do. There's a filmmaker I really like named Paolo Sorrentino, who directed a great film called The Great Beauty back in 2013. It's a masterpiece, fantastic film.
Okay.
But he just came out with a new film, and it's on Netflix. It's called The Hand of God, and I reviewed this film as well. And it's sort of a coming of age story set in the 1980s about this boy who undergoes some tragedy in his life. But obviously, it's well before smartphones or computers or
Yeah.
stuff like that. And he has a series of experiences, which, like, if you're a little sensitive about like seeing nudity in movies and like stuff like that, like this might not be the movie for you. But he ends up like seeing a real naked woman, like with his real eyes, and then he also undergoes these losses in his life, like people die who are close to him and all this sort of thing. And it all sort of heads in this direction of him becoming fascinated with the theater and with in
This is called
creating this.
the hand of God.
It's called The Hand of God. Yeah. And the title of the movie is related to the famous goal from the 1986 World Cup by
Yeah.
Diego Maradona.
Yeah.
If you're a soccer fan. Um, but anyway, the movie, I digress, but the movie really encapsulates this. And it's something that I identified with. I mean, the movie is set a little bit before I would have been coming of age, but, there was a lot of it that I identified with, like just this sense of like this physicality that's also kind of soulful and that like creates this like desire for mystery and like just this understanding that love is this like very, like, I don't know, spiritual thing, holy
Yeah.
thing, in a
Yeah.
way that even like a kind of simple encounter can spark something magical. So this movie was really refreshing to me in that regard because there just aren't a lot of things like that out right now.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a complicated issue. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I'm wondering if maybe the pendulum will swing back at some point and we'll kind of look back on this age as a very sort of cold time. I don't know.
I don't know either. I am sympathetic to your argument about smartphones, though the smartphone revolution. I just wonder. I just wonder if there's an escape from the smartphone revolution. The irony is, China gets so many things wrong, especially on human rights, and they are almost never a model for us in any regard. But I do think it's interesting that the Chinese Communist Party has been proactive in limiting its kids' screen time.
Hmm.
So much so that there's like there are I mean, this is not the way to go about it, national mandates, but they recognize this as a problem, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And they have like national mandates limiting the video game time per week that children can spend. And this is part of like an overall sort of digital strategy about protecting their population. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for anything like that in the West. I'm just saying this is a real problem, and even an authoritarian government like China recognizes that its people are not best served through having phones in their pockets and access to
Yeah.
technology like that all the time. I think you're absolutely right that having access to everything, TikTok videos, for example. I talked to an adult man who told me that he probably does watches 2 hours of TikTok videos every single day,
Wow.
and a filmmaker has a real challenge in like telling these sweeping movies of beauty and passion when they're competing with these. I mean, I don't even know how long. I don't have TikTok, but I think they're like 5 to 20 second long videos, generally speaking, right? So how do you compete with that? These videos that are, and literally like they're specifically engineered. TikTok as an app is engineered to maximize the dopamine and serotonin hits in the human brain, right?
Mhm.
And the movies and the stories that good filmmakers tell are not engineered in the same way, with good reason. But how do you compete with that? You don't,
Right.
right? And so to your point about how people would rather build like a Minecraft or a Fortnite world, I think people would rather interact. There is no real interaction, but they'd rather interact with a porn star or something on their phones or on their
Yeah.
tablets, computer, whatever, than actually, to Douthat's point, go to the bar and play the field. There's much less risk, right?
Oh, yeah.
Much less risk, and there's more sort of more guaranteed brain chemistry surges of the things, the dopamine and the serotonin, or whatever, as opposed to the risk of exposure or humiliation that you have if you go to a bar and try to play the field. Now, like going to a bar and playing the field is not something that I'm advocating for, and neither is
Sure.
Dalvit, but just pointing to
Right.
it as a trend. Like that's not happening. What's happening instead is the 2 hours of TikTok and the Pornhub and whatever else.
Yeah, and a few years ago, there was a great book called iGen by Jean Twenge, and she sort of prophesied some of this as well. I mean, right down to things like teenagers aren't even getting their driver's licenses anymore. Like, I mean, when I turned 16, I couldn't wait. I mean,
Totally. Yeah.
absolutely couldn't wait to go get
Yep.
my driver's license. And nowadays, they just don't care. I mean,
Yep.
where's there to go? I mean,
Right.
it's not really
All
anywhere
my friends are
interesting.
online. Yeah. My
Yeah.
my world that I built for myself is online. Why would I go anywhere?
And I'm sure you've observed, and here I'm just sounding like an old fuddy-duddy now, but I mean, my wife and I observe this all the time, that when we will see young people actually out doing something, and they're all just looking at their phones. They're
Yeah.
not actually, interacting with each
Yeah.
other, like, sort of, I don't know, like, understanding each other as these, like, embodied souls that are moving along in the world next to them.
Yeah.
So yeah,
My
we're
least
both.
favorite is like young parents we see out with their kids, and like their kid does something cute and the parents like, oh, let me just get a picture of it, and so they spend more
Yeah,
time like pulling up the camera on their phone than just being present with their child. We have
yeah.
we have like an appallingly low number of pictures of our kids because we try. I'm not saying that we're perfect. We're certainly not perfect, but one thing we try to do is like be actually present in the moment, and so there are less candid shots that we have of our kids because we're trying to like be there and fully experience it with them, and I think that's a good thing.
I agree. One of my favorite tweets of all time is from the actor Bill Murray, who once tweeted, I can remember a time when I would go all day without taking a picture of anything. Which I think that
Yeah,
all the
that's pretty
time. Like,
good.
how many
Yeah.
days do I go where I've
Yeah.
taken a picture of
Uh,
nothing, where I
yeah.
don't feel the need to mediate my experience
Yeah.
through my device, and then sort of translate it back out into the world through a social media account. I don't want to. I'm not holding myself up as someone who's holier than thou on this. I
Certainly
I
not.
do,
Yeah. Same
I
here.
do
Yeah.
I do these things, and it's the water that we swim in right now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I do think it's taking a toll on our ability to really love each other. To be
Yeah.
honest, to really live in
Yeah.
the world.
I completely agree with you. And hopefully there's a way out. I mean, we know that Jesus wins in the end. But I think there is a real challenge for people like you and me, and for serious Catholics out there, or even non-Catholics who just recognize this as a problem. And there's a serious question about how do we move forward? How do we get out of the smartphone world? So, any parting words of wisdom before we wrap up on that, Andrew?
Well, all I'd say is to maybe bring it back around to Don't Look Up. The whole time I'm watching the movie, I thought to myself, well, I really hope a comet doesn't come and destroy the Earth. I have lots of things I'd like to do with my life. I have children I'd
Yeah.
like to see grow up and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But what if there was some kind of catastrophe that, could just, I don't know, like destroy the internet or something like that? Now,
Yeah.
that would be really bad. That would be really bad for a while, but hey, maybe that would be a blessing. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not wishing anything like that, but at the same
Sure.
time, there's
Sure.
part of me that's curious. That's curious about what the effect might
Yeah.
be on humanity.
Well, I've often wondered, and I've even wondered this out loud publicly. I've said, I wonder if the internet is actually a net gain for humanity, right? Like
Yeah.
I get it, like it's enabled, leaps in R&D and certainly medical advances and all that. And I have no doubt that at least many lives have been extended through the technologies that we gain through the internet. But I wonder if on net we become more fundamentally human because of the internet. I suspect we have not.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then that's not a good thing on balance. So
Well, especially now as we're being invited into the metaverse and all of that sort of thing. But here we are joining the
yeah.
ranks of the hypocrites who are using the internet and modern technology to complain
Yes.
about it. So,
Yeah, I
but
know
oh
it's
well,
it's
so it
very true.
goes.
Yeah, good point. Well, Andrew, thanks for joining me today. It was a pleasure to chat with you, as it always is. I commend your work on worldonfire.org to various folks, where you are once again, as I mentioned, the fellow of popular culture at the Word on Fire Institute. How else can people follow your work, or if they want to read more of your stuff, where can they do it?
You can catch up with me on Twitter at Andrew Petiprin, and or you can check out my website, andrewpetiprin.com.
Perfect. And I will link those in the show notes, as well as, like I said, your article about it. Don't Look Up, Andrew. And I think you said you reviewed Hand of God, so I'm going to try to find that one as well, and we'll link that in the show notes.
Absolutely. Great.
All right, to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Creedle. Appreciate you dialing in and watching or listening to this. If you're on YouTube watching, if you're on a podcast player listening. If you have any questions for me or Andrew, send me a note, Zach, ZAC, at creedlepodcast.com. And until next time, God bless you.